Today I'm going to show you some basics on throwing on the wheel. First, what you should do is start out with some fresh clay. So make sure you get clay that has not been recycled yet. It's in a nice block. And you should cut 4 cubes of clay so that you can then make 4 balls of clay to use. You'll be practicing a lot first. And so you'll want to make sure you have a few different options in case it doesn't work out, because you won't make a perfect bowl on the first time or cylinder. Your hands will get really sloppy, and so it'll be handy to have balls of clay ready to go so that if you mess one up, you can move on to the next one. Even sizes are great, but sometimes starting out with a little bit of a smaller piece of clay is a good way to start. Here we have the wheel, and you'll want to make sure you sit nice and close. You can wear an apron on your legs because it does get a little bit messy. And I have the pedal below me, just make sure it's in a comfortable spot. And you can use the bat to put on the wheel and secure it down. You will also need a bucket of water because you'll always want to keep your clay wet with your 4 balls of clay that you formed. And then I usually have a sponge and some wooden tools like a rib and other boxwood tools so that I can help form the clay as well. The first thing you want to do, make sure your clay is in a nice round ball, and you'll want to wet your wheel a little bit. You don't want to make it too shiny because you don't want it to slide around. So just get a little tiny bit of water on it. And then you can plop the clay down and pat it a couple times so that it is as centered as possible. And then we are ready to start forming the clay with very wet hands so that our hands glide on the clay easily. To turn the wheel on, you can press the button, and you can either have it moving clockwise or counterclockwise. If you're right-handed, you should be working in this part of the wheel between 6 and 3 o'clock at all times, and the wheel should be going counterclockwise. So let's see. It is going counterclockwise. If you're left-handed, you will click the other button to reverse the movement of the wheel. Like I said, the goal is always to have really wet hands so your hands do not stick onto the wheel. And you want to sit nice and close because I'm pushing my elbow into my hip and I am pushing my hand against the clay like this, the meaty part of my hand against the bottom of the wheel. You can see as your hand moves, it's not centered. And so the goal is to really use a lot of pressure to squeeze the clay so that it is centered, so my right hand stops moving. You want to make sure you keep your hands wet. The goal is to use your right hand to really muscle it into the center so that it is not wobbling. And then you're ready once you have a nice gumdrop shape and it's sealed onto the wheel. Then you're ready to open up the clay as soon as I get this evened out on the top as well. Always make sure you put a little bit of water on the clay. You don't want it to be too messy. Sometimes I scrape my hand off so that I get the excess chunky clay off. And when you wet the clay, you don't want to just sprinkle the water on, you actually want to touch all the surfaces so it glides easily. I raised it up a little bit, get off the excess, touch the clay to get it wet. And I'm also pressing my hands against each other to create some support as well. All right. Now I'm ready to open up the clay pot. There are a lot of different methods of how to open up the pot, but the first step is pushing your thumb straight down or your finger straight down, however you choose to do it, and to just create a little divot. You don't want to make it too wide because then it will just flatten out and create this plate. So I'm going to push my thumbs, keep my hands centered, keep my hands really pushed against my hips. Get some water in the center. You can also use 2 fingers if you want as well. Ooh, scraping off some of the clay. You don't want to go too deep. Make sure you wet the surfaces again. You don't want to go too deep. One trick is using a needle tool to poke to see how deep the clay is in the bottom of the pot. Tool in. You can mark it with your finger. It's about this thick, so I could make it a little bit thinner, but I think I'll leave it how it is for now. Maybe I'll go a little bit deeper. Now the trick is to open up the pot. Notice how I didn't make it super wide. I just pushed my thumbs down. Now to open it up, there are a few different methods as well. You always want to push pressure on the outside of the clay, otherwise it will just collapse, and the clay moves wherever it can. So if I'm putting pressure on the outside, it's not going to move out, it has to move up. So I'm going to start squeezing the clay to open it up. I'm going to clean this up a little bit too because it's a little sloppy. I'm not going to add too much more water. Oops. I'll clean off my hands. I like to have my thumb pushed against my hand, and then I put my fingers inside, and so I'm actually going to be squeezing my hand together, pushing both hands together, these fingers, this hand, keeping my hand pushed against my hip straight out, and then I'll be squeezing it to try to raise the pot a little bit. So as you can see, I raised it a little bit, but it's still pretty thick. You can feel how thick the clay is. And the goal is to make some cylinders to start with, just to get practice, not opening up the pot, but just raising it up and thinning out the sides. So I'm going to continue doing that, starting at the bottom. Really make sure you thin out the bottom first before you raise the rest of the pot. So in here I'm getting a little bit of a cylinder, still pretty thick. You can feel how thick the clay is. I have a little bit too much water inside there. I'm wetting all the surfaces first before I continue. It is always, you can see the top of my pot is a little bit uneven, and that is not a good sign. What you want to do, make sure you're always working between here and here. So that means it was a little uneven with the top. One other thing is it's good to work the clay until you destroy it, just to get a feel for what the clay can and can't do. And so don't expect to make a perfect pot on your first try. I'm going to trim the bottom. When you do get one that you want to keep, you can use these tools to do some trimming. I'm holding my hand very steady as I'm trimming. And because the top is uneven, it's not a pot that I want to keep for sure. And so what you can do is, if it's a pot that you make that you don't destroy, you can cut it in half, and see how thick the clay is if you have an even thickness of the wall. One of the goals is to practice getting an even thickness throughout the whole piece. So I'm going to take a wire cutter and then cut it in half just to see how thick the bottom is and how thick and even the sides are. Push this all the way down, the wire tool, wiggle it down to the bottom, hold really close to the bottom, and then just pull. You can even have it spin a tiny bit. I should have cut that off first. Let's see if I can lift it. I'm gonna have to cut the whole bottom off now instead of just half. Oops. When you lift the pot up, if you have one that you want to save or not, make sure you grab from the bottom. You can slide it off, and I'm going to break it in half. And I can see my walls were thick, still too thick at the bottom. It got a little bit thinner, and then especially down here, I needed to open this up a little bit as well. But the bottom was a good thickness. You don't want to go too much thinner than that. But you can see the bottom's really thin. It's pretty thick right here, and then it gets a little bit smaller. This is a pretty good thickness though. That's a good way to see your progress, because you shouldn't expect to make a perfect pot the first time. It takes a lot of practice, especially with centering and just getting a feel for the clay. Any clay that you want to recycle, you can put back in the bag, but you'll see how sloppy it is. So don't try to reuse clay and re-throw it on the wheel. That's why you have at least 4 balls of clay to practice on. You don't want to make them super slimy or goopy. So this is not worth trying to redo. And for cleanup, you'll want to make sure you just wipe down the entire wheel and then clean up your tools as well. Good luck.